Hello, welcome to Talk Wildlife, and my guest today is Keiron Brown, who's the recording officer for Earthworm Society of Britain. Hello, Keiron, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Alan.
Excellent. Right, so Earthworm Society of Britain. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the scene a little bit by just quoting Darwin, because I think everybody that knows anything about earthworms knows that in 1881 he wrote a book about earthworms. And he basically said in that book that we should be grateful to earthworms for the work that they do. And what we'll do is we'll come on to that in a second, because I think, you know, a lot of people, because earthworms are not totally visible all the time, like something like a butterfly and bees and all the rest of it, maybe don't give them the credit that they need. And I think there's a lot said about pollinators, a lot said in national news. Everywhere you look, it's either climate change or it's pollinators, or it's pandas. But I think, you know, without earthworms, we're in dire trouble. So let's start off talking about earthworms. When I look at various websites, I find that, you know, there's various numbers quoted for the number of species of earthworms globally. And it ranges basically from about 3,000 to about 7,000. Obviously, really hard to record. So what do you think is a realistic number? Because I think it's just going to have to be a guess, isn't it?
Well, I think, if I'm honest, I can tell you what it is in the UK. In the UK, we've got 29 species, and that extends to 31 species across the British Isles, because we've got 2 species that are being recorded in Ireland, but not in the UK. However, once we start going outside of Europe, it gets a lot trickier. There are certain parts of the world that they're basically a new frontier in earthworm science. There's large parts of Africa, there's large parts of South America where we really don't have the foggiest. So I'm always very hesitant to put a number on the number of species, because when we've got places like Africa and South America that are known to be really abundant and really, in terms of species richness and species diversity, I think when we're looking at the earthworm species that we do know about, we really don't know how much more it's going to be than we currently know. I've heard similar estimates, 3,000 to 7,000. My area of expertise really is British earthworms, so I would stick to that 3,000 to 7,000, and I'd put a big caveat that with an asterisk saying could be much higher.
Yeah, I reckon it probably is, you know, but what do I know? So just tell me the figures for Britain again.
Yeah, so we've got 29 species of earthworm within the UK. So that's Northern Ireland, Great Britain. And then we've got 31 if we include the Republic of Ireland as well. Now, there's obviously a chance that those 2 species that have been recorded in Ireland are also recorded in Northern Ireland. And the reason for that I'm particularly confident that could be the case, they're so under-recorded across the whole of the British Isles. So if we talk about the number of individual earthworm records that we have, the Earthworm Society of Britain holds 3,971 on a platform called the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, where they're publicly available. We also have access to an extra 1,444 records from the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. So that means in the UK and Channel Islands, 1,322 records. Now, if we add in Ireland's records, it only goes up to 16,532. So it's just over 1,200 records in Ireland. So yeah, we still know very little about the earthworms, even within the UK.
Yeah. Well, looking at, so, you know, you've mentioned how many species there are in the country, and that might surprise a lot of people, because I think a lot of people thought an earthworm was an earthworm, and when you dug it up and you got a little one, it was a baby big one. You know, and if it was a different colour, well, it was still an earthworm. So I think it'll surprise quite a lot of people that there actually are different species of earthworms. So what's the largest and smallest of the earthworms that you'll find here?
Okay, so the largest one is the lobworm. It's got the scientific name Lumbricus terrestris, and it's, until recently we said it was up to 35 centimetres. I think it can get a bit bigger on the continent, but it's actually been found on a Scottish island and in Chester. So where you're from, Alan,
Yeah.
at 40 centimeters. So 40 centimeters long is quite a big animal. It's big for an invertebrate for sure. The smallest though, so if you think we've got 40 centimeters, we've got something like that big, then the smallest is a species that doesn't have a common name. It's called Dendrobina pygmaea. It's thought to be relatively rare and was almost declared extinct in the UK until the Earthworm Society of Britain started getting people out looking for earthworms. It's a tiny little earthworm that an adult can be as small as just 1.5 centimeters long. So that's a big difference to 40 centimeters in length. And you find that one. So whereas you'll find the lobworm coming out of your lawn and putting leaves into its burrow in the evening, you'll find Dendrobina pygmaea deep in deadwood. So it feeds and lives within rotting deadwood. So yeah, we'll talk about this I'm sure a bit later, but there's a lot of differences between how these different species interact with their environments and the habitats that you find them in as well. But I just want to go back to something you said about people assuming that there's just one species of earthworm, because actually when I've quizzed people on this, you kind of get two polar opinions. If you ask people how many species of earthworm, some people say aren't they all just an earthworm? But then other people, because they're invertebrates, they'll make these wild estimates that we have hundreds or thousands of species like we do with things like beetles, flies, wasps. But actually, for an invertebrate group, there's not that huge amount of numbers. So that's what makes them, when people want to really get into recording and identifying, although you do need to use a microscope, etc., to ID them, so they can be a little bit tricky. They're a really manageable group as well, because 29 species in the UK, and some of them are quite rare. So most of them, it's about 20 or so of them that you'll probably see more commonly.
Yeah, and just to put, because the audience varies for Talk Wildlife, so I'm just going to put into context. A slow worm is not an earthworm. A slow worm is a reptile, so it's not an earthworm. However, with you talking about the 40 centimeter long one, I can understand why people might confuse a large earthworm with maybe even a small snake, but a slow worm. So just wanted to put that into context. So
I think, Alan, before you go on, I think it's worth actually defining what a worm is. So a worm is not a scientific or taxonomic term. A worm is, the dictionary definition is that it's a burrowing elongated creature that doesn't have any appendages, any limbs. It doesn't have wings, it doesn't have legs, anything like that. So there are lots of things that are called worms. So we have earthworms, we have things like people call slow worms, we have glowworms. So there are lots of different things that are called worms. When we're talking about an earthworm, they're what we call an annelid or a segmented worm. So if you find something that is a worm and it doesn't have segments on it, it's not an earthworm. It might be some kind of flatworm, but it's not an earthworm. So, and earthworms are particularly segmented worms that you find on land, often living in the soil or deadwood and things like that, and they're very closely related to leeches. So leeches are another segmented worm, but obviously leeches have very different mouth parts, and we won't go into that.
Oh yeah, it's a whole different story, that one. But it's interesting because you just answered the question I was about to ask, which was about sort of worms and their sort of structure and their anatomy. I mean, they spend most of the time underground. So how are they adapted to do that? Let's start at the basics. So first of all, you see a slithering worm. Do they have a brain?
So earthworms actually do have a pinhead-sized brain. So it was like Darwin.
Politicians.
Exactly. We won't name them, but yeah, maybe quite a few of them. And Darwin actually, he did a lot of experiments in his own garden showing that earthworms had intelligence, and he did this by watching how they knew and automatically what the best way to pull a leaf into the ground was. And he tormented his poorer worms actually, because he would pull the leaves out of their burrow each evening and then observe how they pulled them in and monitor whether they were pulling them in the most efficient way. So to pull in a a leaf, it's better to pull it in by the pointy end, because it will then curl when you're pulling it in. Whereas if you try and pull it in from the middle, it's gonna get stuck when you're trying to pull it into your burrow. And he took that a little bit further, and he actually started putting down all sorts of. He cleared all the leaves from around the earthworms' burrows, and then put down paper triangles and tested to see if they just knew how to do it with leaves, or if actually they had some intelligence and could figure out the best way with these paper triangles. And he proved that they were able to establish what the best way of pulling in an individual paper triangle was. And they were different, these paper triangles were different shapes, etc. And what was really interesting, what shows they've got true intelligence there, is that they didn't figure it out through trial and error. They just knew. They knew most of the time what the best way to pull it in was. And that's really interesting, because they actually don't have eyes. So it's interesting that they must have been establishing that through feeling the triangle.
That's incredible. That, well, isn't nature, but so what about heart, lungs? How, because they're underground, so how are they adapted to be able to cope underground?
So earthworms are traditionally, like the group of animals that earthworms belong to, most of those things you find in either a marine or a freshwater environment. So earthworms are a bit different from us. They don't have lungs, and they actually breathe through their skin. So that means that earthworms need to remain moist in order to breathe through that moisture layer on their skin. Just like with us, we have a moisture layer inside our lungs. So that's why you get earthworms on the pavement after it's raining, and there's been a sunny spell, and they look a bit, sorry, they look like they're on their last legs. No, yeah. They don't have legs. And that's because they've dried out, so they're then struggling to function. So they don't have lungs as such. They breathe through the moisture layer on their skin. In terms of, do they have a heart? Well, invertebrates generally don't have hearts. They don't have blood like us. But this is where earthworms are different from a lot of other invertebrates that you get, like bees and spiders, etc. Earthworms actually do have a circulatory system. And if you damage an earthworm, if you cut it in half, if that ever happens again next time you're out gardening, have a look and you'll see that they actually do bleed, and their blood is red, and that's because they do have hemoglobin in their blood, and they don't have hearts like we have hearts. They have what we call a pseudo heart. It's like a primitive heart. It's a thickened blood vessel, and British earthworms tend to have 5 pairs of those, but that will vary in earthworms around the world. But yeah, British earthworms tend to have 5 pairs of hearts. Yeah, they're obviously another adaptation to living underground is the shape of their body. So they have muscles along their body and around the segments that help them contract, etc. And they have tiny little bristles, tiny little hairs called setae that they can use to grip and then to push forward. So that's how they're able to burrow.
Right, okay, and you mentioned cutting them in half. Now, I am not advocating people rushing out into the garden, finding the worm and chopping it in half. However, let's talk about regeneration. So, because this is interesting to me now, especially after what you just said. Worms can regenerate, am I right? So if you chop bits off, they can regrow it, or they can heal it. Which is it? Well,
so there's a bit of an old wives' tale that if you cut an earthworm in half, you'll get 2 earthworms. That's not true. Yeah. So firstly, what will happen is both parts will move, just like when a lizard loses its tail, it will still wriggle. It's to help fight off, to help distract that predator that's attacked it. And actually, some earthworms can choose to drop their tail. It's called autotomy, where they'll drop their tail when they feel threatened or stressed. So they can heal their tail, and that can grow back. It can take some time to do that, and it varies by earthworm species. Some are much better at it, some are less good at it. However, if you chop an earthworm in half, you don't get 2 earthworms. The tail end will die. You'll have noticed that on an earthworm they have this thickened part which we call a saddle, or a clitellum, is a scientific name for it, and that saddle is, before the saddle you've got most of the organs. So you've got the brain and you've got the hearts and all of that. If you chop an earthworm between the saddle and the head end, then it's probably not going to survive. However, if you chop it off after if it loses part of its body after the saddle, there is a much higher chance that it will survive and it will regenerate the lost segments. But they don't always regenerate them perfectly. So it's definitely better for an earthworm not to be chopped in half.
Yeah.
And it's not as clear cut as that. Now, I have read about really gory experiments where scientists have grown earthworms from or grown worms from segments, and I think what we need to be clear about is a lot of those experiments are not involving earthworms. They're involving other types of worm.
Yeah.
So people can easily misunderstand when we're talking about worms that we don't specifically mean earthworms there, because there are types of worm where if you chop a little bit off, you can grow two organisms, but not generally with earthworms, and certainly not in natural conditions.
Yeah. Again, you did a brilliant job there of answering the question before I asked it, which is great, because I was going to say to you, and you've explained it now because of where the saddle is and the organs in front of that. Where my mind was going was if the organs were running the full length of the worm and you chop part of it off, then clearly you're damaging its internal organs, and wouldn't that kill it? But you've answered that question, so thanks for that. That's great. And you mentioned about you get some earthworms that are specialists in the soil and drag leaves into the soil. So to what depth, first of all? I mean, are you talking about you get species that specialize in various depths, or are you talking about you've got this just Serengeti type free for all with worms like that much deep down into how deep do they go?
Well, they can certainly go over 2 meters, and they'll go deeper when the conditions are not right. But what we do so if we're talking about earthworms, I think it's good to clarify some broad groups of earthworms, because you can divide them. In the UK, we divide them broadly into 4 groups. In reality, it's a bit more complicated than that, because certain species will be a bit of one and a bit of another, or maybe even a bit of 3 different types. But the 4 groupings that we have, that we classify them, are, first of all, you have the anesic earthworms, which are the deep burrowing earthworms. And these earthworms are probably like that one you've got in the picture behind you. These are the big boys of the earthworm world, including that one that grows up to 40 centimeters. They tend to be quite long, and they will burrow deep down, and they'll have a vertical burrow, and they'll come out of that burrow at night and gather the food that they eat, which is usually decaying plant material like leaf litter and things like that, and they'll bring it down into their burrow. And what they'll do is they'll eat those leaves, but they'll also eat some of that deep soil. Now, soil deep down in the soil profile really doesn't have much in terms of nutrients or anything like that, so it's really nutrient poor. It's not the best soil for growing things.
Yeah.
In the earthworm's gut, the leaves will break down and they'll mix with that soil, and then they'll cast or poop on the surface, and that will be really nutrient rich. So they will live in a vertical profile in that manner. Then going up through the soil profile, you've then got the shallow burrowing earthworms, the endogeics. And these earthworms will be very pale. They often look sickly. So if you're digging in your garden and you find an earthworm that looks like it's ill, it's probably not ill. It's probably an endogeic earthworm. And they're usually anything from a relatively medium size through to almost as big as some of the anesics. And they will only eat soil. So they'll rarely come to the surface, and they'll just live in horizontal, semi-permanent burrows. So whereas the anesic earthworm will have its burrow system that it keeps using, the endogeic earthworms or shallow burrowing earthworms they'll be burrowing through the soil all the time, but they will reuse their burrows a little bit, but they'll still be chomping away at the soil. So they're breaking down the soil further in that top layer. Then actually you have 2 types of earthworm that you don't really get living in the soil. You've got the epigeic earthworms, which live above. They're the surface dwelling earthworms, and these earthworms will actually just live loose in the leaf litter. You'll find them in deadwood, you'll find them under deadwood or under stones, etc., things like that. and they're again eating, they're feeding on the decaying plant material, so things like leaf litter, things like that. And then finally, you've got another group, which isn't, it's not always classed as a separate group because it's kind of a subset of the epigeics. But the epigeics tend to be quite small. You've got these bit larger, medium-sized earthworms that are stripy in appearance, and we call those the compost earthworms. So people might know one species, Icenia fetida, as the brandling worm or the tiger worm. And these compost specialists, we call them compost earthworms, but really what they are is specialists in habitats where you've got really high organic content. So they love compost heaps. That's why they're great for us to use in our gardens. But they, in nature, you'd find them in really rotten deadwood and in manure as well. So animal dung. And they're the 4 types of earthworm. And working all together, if you bring all those 4 groups together, you've got this comprehensive mechanism for breaking down all sorts of different things in natural environments. So as a whole group, the earthworms are really important decomposers, but we've got these 4 groups doing very different jobs within that process.
Yeah. I want to come on to that in a minute as to why they're important, but I'm going to ask you a question that might be a bit sort of off the wall, but I was asked it about slugs once.
Yeah.
And while you were talking, I thought, I'll ask it about worms as well. When we get really, really cold winters, why don't worms freeze?
Well, so there's a couple of techniques that earthworms can use to get around really cold winters and also really hot summers. Remember, earthworms don't like it too hot. They need to stay moist. So there's 2 mechanisms they'll use. 3 really. So one is for them to go deep into the soil. So they'll go deep into the soil to try and avoid the frosts. So that's why when I said you'll get them down to 2 meters, but they can go further, they will go even further down to avoid. So yeah, escaping. And when they're down there, what they'll do is they'll hibernate. So they'll go into a state of torpor where they're really slowing down their metabolism so that they're not wasting energy and so that they can see out the difficult times. And what they'll do is actually tie themselves in a knot. So you'll get this ball of earthworm, and they'll do it singularly. They don't do it in groups. So you get this balled up earthworm in a knot, and that's to reduce the volume surface area so they're not losing heat through their long elongated bodies. So that's one mechanism for seeing out the winters. And so if you've got an earthworm species that's going to live multiple years, it's going to need to do that. The second thing that they can do, where you've got an earthworm species that maybe doesn't even live a full year from start to finish, then what they can do is they can see out the difficult times in a different life stage. So I'm sure we'll come to this later, but when an earthworm starts off as a cocoon, so it's an egg within a little cocoon, and that cocoon's quite tough, and that can see out many different types of many different problematic environmental conditions, and that includes potentially frosts and hot weather, and it might just be that the natural life cycle of a certain species is that they're adults for a certain part of the year and they avoid winter by having the cocoon stage. So it might be very difficult, for example, to find those epigeic earthworms that we mentioned that live above the ground. They're quite small. They might be there just as cocoons. So the next generation is on its way, but it's difficult to find the adults.
Yeah, before we do move on, let's talk about life cycles. So 2 questions here. Number 1, what is the life cycle? How does it work? And number 2, how long do they live?
Yeah, so for the life cycle, before I explain, the best thing to do is to go on the Earthworm Site of Britain's website and look at our life cycle page, because we've got a wonderful diagram that was given to us to use, and it explains it much better than I can. But like I said, if we go back to the cocoon, because that's where it all starts, you've got the cocoon in the soil, and the cocoon is like a lemon-shaped case that has an egg or multiple eggs within it. Most UK species, I think, is just a single egg within. So within that egg, there's a little baby earthworm developing, and once that gets to a certain size, which again it'll differ by species, but once it's big enough to hatch, it will hatch out of the cocoon, and it'll just be a tiny little earthworm. So very small. It won't have a saddle, and as it feeds and gets older, it'll get bigger till it gets to adult size. And when it gets to adult size, and it's a juvenile essentially, the earthworm version of puberty is to grow their saddle. So if you ever find an earthworm and it doesn't have a saddle, that means it's actually a juvenile or a baby earthworm. Once it's got its saddle, it's sexually mature, and then it's ready for mating. Now this is where earthworms start really differing from people, because earthworms are not, well, I was going to say they're not male or female, but that's untrue. They're both male and female, so they're what we call simultaneous hermaphrodites. And that means that they've got both male and female parts, and when they mate, they play the part of both a male and a female. So when earthworms get jiggy with it, both earthworms hopefully go away. I'm not sure if this is the right term, but impregnated. They'll line up, and they'll 69, I suppose, is the best way of explaining it. So you've got earthworm 1, earthworm 2 come together, and they start releasing this mucus, and form this what we call a slime tube around them that keeps them together, and then they actually will both they'll both pass on their sperm to the other earthworm externally. It travels within the slime tube down the side of the body where it's stored, and then the earthworms will separate. So if you think about it, within this, you've got the earthworm storing its own eggs in a separate store. It's got the sperm of another earthworm. What will then happen is, it's quite complicated. I should have warned you at the beginning. What will then happen is the saddle will form this mucus sheath, and this mucus sheath will move from the saddle towards the head of the earthworm. While it's moving down the earthworm, it will pick up its own eggs, then it will pick up the sperm from the earthworm partner that it's mated with, and within that mucus sheath, the egg will be fertilized by the sperm. And then when the mucus sheath comes off the top of the head, it will form a cocoon. So that's why they're lemon shaped, because it's actually a mucus sheath. So if you imagine it, a ring coming off the end of the earthworm, and then it's pinching at both ends. So that's why you've got the lemon shaped cocoon. And then the cycle starts again.
That's incredible. That apart from the fact that you said jiggy, which immediately put Barry White in my head, that is incredible. I mean, I never ever thought about it before, you know, because you just don't. And I thought, oh, easy answer is eggs, and that's brilliant. So thanks for that, because that was really incredible, really incredible. So we know now, and you know, anybody that's got this far into the interview will realise that these things are endlessly fascinating. For a start, so Darwin was dead right when, you know, when he went off and did his research, because what a thing to research. It's just brilliant. But why are they important? Because they are important. They're incredibly important. But why?
Okay, right. I hope you've got time for this. No, there's quite a lot of reasons. So I've mentioned already about their role in decomposition. So we'd literally would be waist high in decaying plant material and manure, feces, other animals' feces, if we didn't have decomposers like earthworms. There are other decomposers out there that play an important part, but earthworms, and particularly earthworms in Britain, are really effective at breaking things down. And there's something I can talk to you about later with that. But yeah, so they're a really important decomposer at all levels. So not just in breaking down plant material like dead wood and leaves and animal waste like manure, but also in breaking down that soil further. Because remember, we've got the endogates that are dealing with the topsoil, and we've got the anesics that are mixing up that bottom soil. So first of all, decomposition. Secondly, we all know that soil is important. So even though we don't talk about it enough, soil health is really important for plant and fungi, and which animals rely on inevitably as well, and including humans. So they're really important for soil health for a multitude of reasons. Soil wouldn't have the structure it has without earthworms. So with the way that earthworms feed on the soil, they actually give the soil particles their structure. So we call them soil aggregates. It's where little particles of soil are stuck together, and earthworms are really instrumental in that. They also break down certain chemical compounds within the soil and make things like nitrogen available. So they're really, really important for nutrient cycling and enabling plants to be able to access nutrients in a form that they can take in, because there's certain compounds that plants can't take up. They need it to be broken down. So earthworms are important for that. We talked about the anesic earthworms bringing that deep soil up to the top of above the soil and pooping it out as casts. So they're actually, as well as adding all these nutrients and everything into the soil from their guts and breaking things down, they're also actually churning the soil. So where we've got farmers that go out and plough their fields to mix up the soil, the earthworms actually do this naturally, so that they are nature's plough. So they are ploughing the earth, they're just not doing it mechanically, and they're not doing it as destructively. So they're really important as nature's plough as well. And while they're burrowing, they're creating air spaces within the soil. Yeah. Now, there's all sorts of organisms that rely on air to breathe. We know that we need it, but you go right down to certain bacteria, like a lot of bacteria, what we call aerobic bacteria, they need that to be able to exist. So they create this aeration into the soil through their burrowing, as does any other burrowing animal. But earthworms are really important for that. Now, those burrows are also important for allowing water to penetrate. Yeah. So they allow drainage into the soil. So they're actually quite important, therefore, for making sure that helping us reduce flood risk as well. If you've got land that's got lots of earthworms, the water will drain into the soil rather than running off it. So just like having trees is important for managing flooding, so are earthworms. What have I missed out? God, there's so much. As well as that, almost any animal in the food chain, so we're talking about how they're important to plants, almost any animal in the food chain you can quite often trace back to earthworms somewhere, any predator definitely, because they're eaten. We've all seen the robin in the garden with an earthworm in their mouth. We've all seen blackbirds dancing around on the soil looking for earthworms. So we know they're really important for our garden birds. The mole wouldn't exist without the earthworm. It's its diet basically. But what people don't realise is animals like foxes and badgers, they will eat a lot of earthworms as well, as will smaller mammals. Hedgehogs will eat a lot of earthworms. So a lot of the things that we know and love, the animals we love to see in our garden, will rely on earthworms for their diet, as will many other invertebrates. And that even includes their close cousin, the leeches. Leeches will eat earthworms as well. And when I've talked to people about this, one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard is birds of prey going for earthworms as well. So we think of birds of prey eating mice and things like that, but actually they will eat earthworms as well. So yeah, a lot of things rely on earthworms, because as much as I love earthworms, they're not very good at seeing off predators. They're pretty helpless, which is why I think a lot of them need to live underground. But once they're above ground, they're easy prey and they're packed full of nutrition for animals. So yeah, those are some of the reasons. I'm sure there's more, but yeah, like I said, I could go on all day.
Yeah, just a quick question before we move on. And you said about defending themselves and they're not very good at it. To your knowledge, are there any poisonous worms, earthworms, in the world?
Yeah, so there's one that we know of, and I've got, yeah, it's poisonous, not venomous. So the difference between that means if something's venomous, it can get poison into your system. If it's poisonous, it means it's poisonous if you eat it. So there's one species called the fried eggs worm. I really recommend Googling it. If you Google it, it's this black worm with these white splodges with little yellow splodges on. So it's called the fried eggs worm for a reason. I think it was recorded in the Philippines for the first time. It's within the last 15 years it was first recorded. So it's this really distinctive looking worm, and it looks like it's pretty poisonous. But I think one of them got damaged when they were collecting them, and when the scientists had found them, then looked later on, they were all dead within the box because my understanding is that they were found to be poisonous. I don't know if they're poisonous to us or what they're poisonous to, but yeah. But in the UK, what earthworms will do as a defense mechanism, apart from we've mentioned about their tails and being underground, what some of them will do is release a foul smelling liquid. So it's not poisonous, but the compost earthworm, Eisenia fetida, it's called Eisenia fetida, fetid is a foul smell. So if you stress out your compost earthworms, you'll see they'll release this like yellow liquid, and that's to deter predators. And it doesn't smell too nice at all.
Great. I'll test that next time I see one. So, moving on to the conservation of them. How are they doing? How are earthworms doing? We hear a lot about sort of pollinators, and that pollinators need our help and all the rest of it. I would have thought it's quite, and we will come on to recording in a minute, but it's quite difficult, especially if you're not getting the numbers, to actually ascertain how they are doing. But how are, as a group, how are our earthworms doing?
Well, so I mean, this is where we really don't know. We really don't know. So until the Earthworm Society was founded, there were areas, most of Wales didn't have records, so we can't say how something's doing unless we know. Also, a lot of the studies that go on, they look at these broad groupings or just general numbers. So again, that doesn't tell us about individual species. That we definitely have some species that seem quite rare. We don't know how rare, because we don't have the information. What I can tell you, Alan, is that no earthworm in the UK had a conservation status applied to it. So for your audience that might not know what I mean by conservation status, there's lots of different terms that can be given, and they range from what we call least vulnerable, meaning that there's no concern about that species, through to extinct, where it's no longer present. And whether an animal is protected or not, quite often, or plant or fungi, depends on what that status is. All earthworm species in the UK have the status not assessed. So they've never been assessed. And then if they were assessed, I would envisage that most, if not all of them, would get the term data deficient, which means they've been assessed and we can't tell. So that's something when we talk about recording, that's something that I hope within my lifetime we'll get to, where we actually have conservation statuses for earthworm species. That's not to say that across the world that there aren't some protected species. So we talked about the largest earthworm in the UK, the largest known earthworm, and that's important. The largest known earthworm is the giant Gippsland earthworm, which is found in the Gippsland region of Australia, and that can grow over 2 meters long. I've heard up to 3 meters long, but measuring an earthworm, which is a creature that can contract and extend, is a very difficult thing to do. And that is, so it's over 2 meters long. So this is a really big animal, and that is endangered and it's protected in Australia. And its threat comes from agriculture. So, but it's a tricky one as well, because it can't be bred successfully in captivity. They've never managed to do that. So conserving it is purely about conserving the area that it lives in. But we don't have anything in the UK that has an assessment like that. And there are certainly some species that I've never found. So maybe we do have some species that we need to understand a bit better and try and get that conservation status for. But yeah, normally when we're talking about earthworm health, we're talking about population health within a given area. So quite often it's agricultural, all about woodland. Are there a healthy number of earthworms within that habitat?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you how people can help in a second, and that includes how they can help generally in the gardens, or elsewhere, and then also how they can help with the recording scheme. But one quick question before I go into that.
Yeah.
If it's between 2 and 3 meters long, how thick is it?
Oh, you've got me there. I don't know off the top of my head.
No, but you would have thought in order for it to sustain itself, for it to be that long, you'd think it'd have to be relatively thick, otherwise it keeps snapping.
No, they're not. They're not a great deal thicker than our thickest ones, because I've seen a video. So there's a David Attenborough video where he goes educating people about these from one of his documentaries, and he comes across one, but it doesn't look like it's the biggest one, but they don't get too thick. So we're not talking the same thickness as a snake that's that length or anything like that. So they're relatively thin compared, but their cocoons are like that big. So their cocoons they're a decent size. They're much more elongated. And in that video, Sir David holds it up to the light, and you can see the earthworm inside. So it's well worth having a look on YouTube for the David Attenborough video on the giant earthworm.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. So, right, okay, so how can people help? Because it's easy to say, right, well, pollinators plant a few plants, birds stick food in your garden, hedgehogs stick them at home. How do you help earthworms? If you're a man in the street, how can you help them? And then we'll come on to the recording as well.
Okay, so I think, again, there's not a lot of guidance on this, because earthworms, although generally appreciated by most people, there's not a lot of guidance out there. And so with pollinators, there's so many projects and things like that about helping. With earthworms, there's much less. And when I talk to people about earthworms, quite often people make the assumption that, yeah, but earthworms, people don't really care about earthworms. But actually, nobody really hates earthworms, except golf course managers, who sometimes don't like earthworms for obvious reasons. But yeah, people have a really good appreciation that earthworms are not a pest, and that they're great for their gardens. So I actually think there's probably quite a lot of people out there who want to help their earthworms. So my advice, based on no scientific study at all, but my general advice of understanding earthworms is, if you want to help earthworms, you need to think about those 4 groups that we discussed earlier in the talk, because there's not really one thing to do to help earthworms in general, because you've got to think about the 4 different groups. So think about things you can do to make sure that all 4 of those groups can thrive in your garden. So if we start off with the deep burrowing earthworms and the epigeic earthworms, the surface dwelling ones, they both eat decaying leaves. So you need leaves in your garden. Don't sweep up your leaf litter, because that is the food for them. And more than that, with the epigeic earthworms, it's their habitat. So you don't have leaves, then you're gonna struggle to get them. So that's the first thing that you can do. So let's say you've got a lawn, you don't have leaves. If you're mowing your grass, why not leave some of the grass clippings on the grass? Keeping a tidy garden and removing things from your garden means you're removing those nutrients, you're removing those important things that can be recycled back into your garden. If you're having to put fertilizer on things, then you're doing something wrong, because it means you're taking the nutrients out and then having to put nutrients in a chemical form, and that's not good for most types of wildlife in your garden. So that's another top tip. Don't use chemicals, and where you can, leave stuff. Now, if you do want to have a tidy garden, there's ways that you can recycle that material without it leaving the site of your home. And that's the obvious thing here. If we think about that fourth group, the compost earthworms, then have a compost bin, have several compost bins. If you want to do something that's good for nature in general, even have a compost heap, because that will provide a habitat for hedgehogs to hibernate in and things like that. And fantastic habitat for slow worms if you want to go for a vertebrate worm as well. Another thing that we haven't really talked about, but if you've got space for a tree, we actually have some earthworm species. Some of those epigeic ones are actually, they'll even go arboreal. So they'll go up into the tree and they'll live in rot holes in the tree. So having a tree means that they've got that habitat. And it also provides a bit of variation on the ground. So you've got cooler patches where the tree shades it and you've got your source of leaves. Another thing that we haven't talked about is some of our rarer earthworms, which might not be rarer, they might actually just be more under-recorded, are the wet soil specialists. So there are some earthworms that you'll only get when the soil is really, really wet. Not everybody has space for a pond that will have wet habitat around it. So making a little mini bog area in your garden where you maybe dig it up and put a layer of plastic in there that will slow the drainage, fill it back in. A bog area like that is going to be fantastic for encouraging specific species of earthworms. And I think, yeah, so I think thinking of all those things, not putting chemicals on the soil will help the endogeics as well, because it's not polluting their environment. So yeah, if you do all of those things, then you've created habitats for all four types. But my big tip, most important thing anybody can do, because not everybody has space for all of that, even if you've just got a bit of decking or you've got a bit of a paved area, putting down some plant pots, putting down things on there will create a habitat under there that the earthworms will use. And if you ever want to see the different types of earthworm, having a plant pot on a patch of soil, or even on concrete, even where it's nice and damp, or yeah, they even love being under bin bags full of stuff. If you look under there, you'll quite often find even 3 of the different groups of earthworm. I don't know the specifics why, but that's a great habitat for earthworms. They seem to love it and shelter there. So yeah, so even if you've just got a small patch of concrete, a load of different plant pots on there, with plants in obviously as well, and that'll provide a habitat for earthworms.
Brilliant. Bear with me a sec, I'm just going to go and let them in.
Yeah, no worries.
I left the key in the door, so I won't be a sec. I can edit this bit out. We're virtually done anyway, I won't be a sec. Right, sorry about that.
No problem.
Right, so what I'll do is I'll go from where we were then, just onto the recording. So, okay, so that's sort of quite a few practical things people can do, but the Earthworm Society as well is looking for records. You've mentioned it a number of times throughout the interview. So how can people get involved in the recording schemes that you've got going?
So the Earthworm Society of Britain was set up in 2009 in response to there being a complete lack of earthworm data, really. And most of the data that we've got is based on agricultural and woodland research, which really biases what we know, because it means we know most about earthworms that you get in those habitats. So the problem with recording earthworms, so this is where it gets a bit tricky, is that because earthworms are quite difficult to tell apart, you actually need to go out collecting them, preserving them, and then identifying them with a microscope. Now, we don't expect everybody to do that, so that's understandable. But if you want to learn how to do that, then the Earthworm Society of Britain does provide training. There's a fantastic book from the Field Studies Council on how to identify earthworms. Earthworms are relatively easy in that they only have 5 features that we use to ID them, but you do need a microscope to see those features. However, there are other ways that people can help the Earthworm Society of Britain. So one thing we've got running at the moment is a earthworm compost survey, because what we'd like to know is how many people have compost bins, heaps, etc. around the country, and what type of systems they use, whether they introduced earthworms there or whether the earthworms found their own way there, and what kind of things they put into their composting systems. So this is something that the Earthworm Society of Britain is hoping to get more involved in. So we've traditionally done the identification training, and now we're hoping to provide a bit more guidance on how people can vermicompost or compost with earthworms in their gardens. It only takes 5 minutes to do, and you can fill the survey in once per system that you have. So if you have 2 bins and a compost heap in your garden and you use them all in a slightly different way, you fill in the survey for each one, and that's available on the Earthworm Society of Britain's website under the projects tab. Yeah, and apart from that, what you'd like to do is just engage youngsters with earthworms. Then there's a fantastic activity you can do called worm charming. Now, earthworms will respond to vibrations and come out of the ground. The theory is that they do this because they think it's rain, and when it's raining and it's moist, wet on the surface, they can travel easier, so it allows them to disperse. So worm charming is a competition you can do with kids where you give them each a square of land, and you time them, and they have X amount of time to make as much noise, stamp their feet, play musical instruments, whatever, to get earthworms out of the ground. And then you can give prizes for whoever's got the most earthworms or the biggest earthworm. And that's a great way to show children how earthworms are all around us without damaging the soil by digging it, and teach them a little bit about earthworm ecology and behaviour. So yeah. Those are 3 ways that people can get involved.
Brilliant. And just while we're talking about this activity for kids, I heard or saw, I think it was actually on Country File, people using mustard water or something to try and get the worms up. Is that a no-no, or is it?
No. So traditionally, what happened was, when you're surveying for earthworms, you use different methods for the different types. So one traditional way of scientists studying sampling for earthworms is to go and dig set volume of soil out, so square cubes of soil. And when you do that, you get good representation of the shallow burrowing earthworms, and you get some epigeic earthworms sometimes as well, not so much compost earthworms, but it's the anesic earthworms, the deep burrowing earthworms, are quite often underrepresented. A way of getting them out is to pour an irritant on the ground to the earthworms, and traditionally they'd have used, what's it called? Forgot the name of the chemical, but it's one they use in museums for formalin. That's it. So they'll pour formalin on the ground. Now, formalin is really damaging, and it's a carcinogen, so it's not something that we advise people to use. Potassium permanganate was used as well, but that'll kill all the plants there as well. So what has been found to also work is mixing mustard powder with water. It acts in the same way. It doesn't damage the environment, so it's a method for sampling for those deep burrowing earthworms. Now, if you're doing this to engage with children rather than collect earthworms for a scientific study, then what I'd recommend you do is, as soon as the earthworms come out, you have a pot of water and you put them straight in the water. Now, earthworms can breathe in water, so they breathe through moisture, so don't worry about that. The only danger will be if they're kept in water for a long time, they'll use all the oxygen and then suffocate. So if it's just for engaging with kids in a classroom session or a forest school session, then yeah, wash them off straight away, and that's to get the irritant off them. So we want to use the irritant to get them out of the ground, but we don't want the animals to suffer unnecessarily. And then it's important that when you return the earthworm back to its natural environment, that you're not just leaving it above ground, like put it under some leaves, make sure it's washed off.
Right, brilliant. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there. That was endlessly fascinating, and really we could go on all day. But we'll certainly have you back to talk about the recording scheme that you're looking at doing. So because that's again, it's important, and we'll build on what we're doing here. But I have to say thanks very much, because I learned tons there, and I'm sure that everybody that watches this will. So for now, Keiron, thanks ever so much for your time.
No.
And I'll speak to you in the not too distant future.
No worries.
Thanks very much, and I'll speak to you again soon.
All right. Have a nice day. Have a nice
Cheers,
weekend.
take care.
All right.
Bye.